He asked for a divorce after 22 years, then our son handed me the envelope he hid. When Laura Bennett first met Richard, she was 26 and tired of being the responsible one. She had spent most of her childhood helping her mother hold their small household together after her father left. She worked through college, kept lists for everything, balanced every account twice, and learned never to count on money that had not already cleared the bank. Richard was the opposite. He was funny, spontaneous, the kind of man who would drive 2 hours because someone told him about the best pie in the state. He forgot where he put his keys, bought concert tickets before checking the calendar, and once proposed an entire weekend trip because Laura said she had never seen the ocean in winter. He made life feel less like a problem that needed solving. That was what she loved first. 22 years later, Laura knew how complicated first impressions could become. Richard had built a successful insurance brokerage. Laura had left a promising accounting job when their first child, Ethan, was born, then worked part-time for years while raising Ethan and his younger sister, Madison. Later, when the children were older, she returned to full-time work as finance director for a regional nonprofit. Their life became comfortable. Not wealthy in the way Richard liked to joke about someday becoming, but safe. The house was nearly paid off. Ethan was 20, studying engineering 2 hours away. Madison was 17 and applying to colleges. They had retirement accounts, a cabin they rented every summer, and a marriage that had survived job losses, miscarriages, Richard's father's death, Laura's mother's long decline, and the ordinary erosion caused by decades of responsibility. Laura believed they were tired. She did not know Richard had started thinking of tired as trapped. The first sign came on their 22nd anniversary. Laura had reserved a table at a small Italian restaurant they had loved when they were newly married. Richard arrived 20 minutes late. He looked distracted. His phone remained face down on the table. "Happy anniversary," Laura said. He smiled too quickly. "Happy anniversary." They ordered wine. Laura gave him a small box containing a watch strap to replace one he had worn out. Richard stared at it. "You remembered." "Of course." Reached into his jacket. For 1 second, Laura expected a card. Instead, he placed a plain white envelope on the table. "What is this?" Richard did not answer immediately. Laura's stomach tightened. "Richard," he looked at her. "I think we should separate." The restaurant noise seemed to vanish. Laura did not touch the envelope. "What?" "I've been thinking about this for a long time." "How long?" "Months." "Months." "Yes." Laura looked around the room as if someone else might explain what was happening. A couple at the next table laughed. A waiter carried bread past them. Candles flickered. 22 years of marriage sat between a bowl of olives and 2 wine glasses. "Why?" Richard rubbed his hands together. "I'm not happy." Laura stared. It was such a small sentence for such a large destruction. "Not happy how?" "In the marriage." "I gathered that." He flinched. Laura's voice stayed strangely calm. "Is there someone else?" Richard looked away. That was enough. Her name was Natalie Monroe, 34 years old. She worked with one of Richard's commercial clients. The affair had lasted several months. Richard said he had never planned for it to become serious. Laura told him people accidentally missed exits. They did not accidentally carry on affairs. When she asked whether he had discussed leaving the marriage with Natalie, Richard admitted that he had. What hurt most was not that he had imagined another life. It was that he had been living beside Laura while privately rehearsing her absence. Laura left the restaurant alone in the rain. Madison was home when she arrived, surrounded by college essays. "Where's Dad?" she asked. Laura stopped. She had imagined having time. There was never enough time for the things that mattered. "He'll be home later." Madison looked up. "Did you fight?" Laura sat beside her. "Your father and I need to talk to you together." Madison's face changed immediately. "No, I hate when adults say that." Laura almost smiled. Instead, tears filled her eyes. Madison closed the laptop. "What happened?" Laura did not lie. "Your father wants to separate." Madison stared at her. "What?" "He says he's unhappy." "That's stupid." "Madison, it is." Laura nodded. "Right now, I agree." "Is there someone else?" Laura looked at her daughter. She saw herself at 17. That frightened her. "Yes." Richard came home later and faced the anger he had hoped to manage in stages. Madison called him disgusting. The next morning, Richard phoned Ethan. Laura listened from the kitchen. At first, Ethan said nothing. Then he asked, "Who is she?" Richard answered. "How long?" Richard answered again. Then Ethan said, "Does Mom know everything?" Richard looked toward Laura. "I think so." Laura felt cold. Ethan asked, "You think?" Richard closed his eyes. "Ethan." "No, answer the question." "I told her about the affair." "What didn't you tell her?" Richard's face changed. Laura stared at him. Ethan noticed the silence through the phone. "Dad, nothing." Laura walked closer. "What didn't you tell me?" Richard ended the call. There were financial things. Richard had borrowed against the business. He had opened a home equity line on the house Laura believed was nearly paid off. $120,000. Part of it had gone into a restaurant project Natalie and her brother were developing. Richard insisted the investment began before the affair, as if chronology could turn betrayal into sensible risk. There were also $38,000 in personal credit card balances, including hotels and trips connected to Natalie. Laura stood at the kitchen sink trying not to be sick. You spent family money on your affair? Yes, she nodded slowly. That is why Ethan asked whether I knew everything. Richard looked confused. I didn't tell him. Then why did he ask? 2 hours later, Ethan arrived carrying a large manila envelope. He looked exhausted from the drive. I think you need this, he told Laura. Inside were bank statements, loan documents, a draft purchase agreement, and correspondence between Richard and an attorney. There was also a draft life insurance beneficiary change, replacing Laura's name with Natalie's. Richard insisted it had never been finalized. Then Laura found an unsigned deed transfer package, preparing to move the family home from joint ownership into a trust controlled by Richard. Ethan's eyes filled. He said he had accidentally seen emails in Richard's office the previous month and had printed the documents because something felt wrong. You were planning to protect assets before asking for the divorce, Ethan said. Richard denied that wording. Laura did not care about wording anymore. She cared that her son had spent a month carrying evidence that his father might be preparing to remove his mother from the financial life they built together. Laura ordered Richard out of the house. Only then did Richard admit Natalie had already ended the relationship. Laura stared at him. She ended it before our anniversary. Richard nodded. You asked me for a divorce after she broke up with you. It wasn't because of her. For once, Laura believed him. That was worse. Richard had not betrayed 22 years because he had found one irresistible new love. He had betrayed the marriage for himself, for a fantasy of being younger, freer, admired, and unburdened. Natalie had been an opportunity, not the cause. Laura hired an attorney named Denise Coleman, a direct woman in her 50s who listened without interrupting. When Laura finished explaining the affair, home equity line, credit cards, proposed trust, and beneficiary form, Denise leaned back. You have documentation? Laura lifted Ethan's envelope. Denise nodded. Your son may have saved you a very expensive surprise. Laura's eyes filled. I wish he never had to. The divorce became ugly in documents and strangely quiet in person. Richard's attorney described the restaurant financing as a business investment. Denise produced emails showing Natalie's personal stake. Richard's side emphasized that the trust transfer was unsigned. Denise agreed, then asked why it had been drafted. The more Richard tried to describe his actions as preparation rather than theft, the clearer one truth became. He had been planning his exit while Laura was still planning their future. Madison stopped speaking to him. Ethan spoke only when necessary. Laura hated watching it. One evening, Madison sat at the kitchen table and said, I hope he loses everything. Laura looked at her. No, Madison frowned. Why not? Because he's still your father. That doesn't make him a good person. No, you're defending him. I'm defending you from becoming someone who needs another person destroyed to feel safe. Madison's eyes filled. He destroyed you, Laura thought carefully. No, what? He hurt me, he betrayed me, he put us at risk, but he did not destroy me. Not destroyed became something Laura repeated to herself. At the first major hearing, the judge froze major transfers and required both spouses to preserve insurance and retirement assets. Outside the courthouse, Richard told Laura he planned to sell part of his brokerage to pay debts. I want you to know I'm trying, he said. Trying what? To fix what I did. Laura looked at him. You cannot fix betrayal with a balance sheet. Richard's eyes filled. Then he told her Natalie had used him. She wanted financing for the restaurant. After the money was secured, she ended the affair. Laura felt no satisfaction. And now you know how that feels, she said. Richard flinched. The cruelty of the sentence shocked her. I'm sorry, Laura added. You deserve consequences, not every cruel thing I could say. That night, Laura cried harder than she had since the anniversary. Not because she wanted Richard back, because the betrayal did not erase 22 years. There had been love, birthdays, road trips, hospital waiting rooms, bad jokes, Christmas mornings, hands held during fear. The fact that Richard later betrayed her did not make every earlier moment fake. It made the story complicated, and Laura hated complicated. She preferred clean books and balanced accounts. Life refused. 6 months into the divorce, Ethan came home and asked whether she hated Richard. No, Laura said. Why not? Because hate is expensive, and because I knew him before this. Ethan looked away. Does that matter? Yes, people are more than the worst thing they do. Ethan reminded her about the house documents. Laura refused to call the unsigned draft an actual theft. "I'm not excusing him," she said. "I'm refusing to invent extra crimes because the real ones already hurt enough." Ethan began to cry. "I thought if I told you, you'd fall apart." Laura hugged him. "Sometimes being competent makes people forget you can still break." The divorce was finalized 1 year and 12 days after Richard asked to separate. Richard sold part of the brokerage. The home equity line was paid from his business proceeds. The house stayed with Laura. Retirement accounts were divided. Most affair-related card debt went to Richard. The insurance policy remained structured to protect Madison until she finished college. The judge signed. Laura signed. Richard signed. Outside the courthouse, Richard handed Laura another envelope. She almost laughed. "You have terrible timing with envelopes. This one is different." Inside was a 6-page letter. Laura read it that night. Richard did not ask her to return. He did not blame Natalie, alcohol, stress, or a midlife crisis. He wrote about turning 50 and feeling as though every possibility had closed. He wrote that Laura seemed at peace with adulthood while he felt invisible inside it. He admitted mistaking being desired by someone new for becoming new himself. He admitted the restaurant investment, the trust draft, and the beneficiary change. Then he wrote, "The worst thing I did was not fall in love with someone else. I am not sure I ever truly did. The worst thing I did was turn our marriage into a competition you did not know you were in." Laura stopped reading and cried. Richard continued, "I wanted freedom, but I wanted you to absorb the cost of it. I wanted a new life without admitting the old life had value. I wanted Ethan and Madison to see me as brave instead of selfish. I wanted you angry enough that leaving would feel justified. When you did not become the villain I needed, I started hiding more. I am sorry because you trusted me with a life we built together, and I started dismantling it in secret." Laura did not forgive him that night. Forgiveness came later in pieces. 2 years passed. Madison went to college. Ethan graduated and moved to Colorado. Laura adjusted to the quiet house. At first she hated it. Then she learned to enjoy mornings without anyone else's schedule. She painted the dining room, replaced the couch Richard loved and she secretly hated, traveled with her sister and took a cooking class. She dated once, stopped, then dated again. Richard struggled. The brokerage survived, smaller than before. He moved into a modest townhome and began therapy. He started volunteering with a financial literacy program after admitting that his own reckless choices had taught him how easily adults could destroy stability while chasing certainty. His relationship with Ethan slowly repaired. Madison took longer. Richard never pressured her. That mattered. 3 years after the divorce, Madison graduated. Richard and Laura sat beside each other. When Madison crossed the stage, both parents stood. Afterward came photographs, one with Laura, one with Richard, one with both. "Try not to look divorced," Madison said. Laura laughed. Richard replied, "That feels discriminatory." For the first time, the four of them laughed without tension swallowing the moment. At dinner, Madison gave Laura a box containing a key to her new apartment. "Emergency only," she warned. Richard joked, "Do I get one?" Madison said no. Then she handed him another box, a key. Richard's eyes filled. "Same rule, especially for you." It was a small moment, but Laura understood. Their family had survived, not restored, not unchanged, but honest enough to continue. 4 years after the divorce, Laura met James Holloway at a charity event. He was 55, divorced, quiet, and worked as a civil engineer. Their first date lasted 40 minutes because Laura had another commitment. James liked that. "You schedule dating like a dental cleaning." "I have boundaries." "That sounds terrifying." "It should," he smiled. Laura told him about Richard early. James did not say he would never do such a thing. Laura appreciated that. Promises about hypothetical virtue had become meaningless. He simply said, "I'm sorry that happened." When James eventually asked whether Laura still loved Richard, she answered yes. "You're not worried?" Laura asked. James shook his head. "You can love someone and not want a life with them." They married 2 years later in a small ceremony. Ethan walked Laura down the aisle. Madison stood beside her. Richard was not invited. Laura told him directly, "I don't want our history sitting in the front row while I start something new." Richard admitted it hurt, then said he understood. On the wedding day, he sent flowers with a simple card, "Wishing you peace and a good life." Years later, Richard had a heart attack. Ethan called Laura. James picked up the car keys without being asked. At the hospital, Richard survived surgery and later requested to speak with Laura alone. "Do you remember that envelope Ethan brought you?" he asked. "Hard to forget." I hated him for months. I know. I thought he betrayed me. He didn't. No, he protected you. Richard looked at the ceiling. I spent years thinking betrayal was something that happened to me after Natalie left. I was so focused on what I lost that I couldn't see what I had done. He reached into the bedside drawer and produced another envelope. Laura groaned, "You have terrible instincts." Richard laughed weakly. Inside was a notarized estate amendment. His remaining interest in the brokerage would be divided equally between Ethan and Madison. A separate account would repay Laura for investment losses connected to the restaurant project beyond what had been settled in divorce. "You don't owe me this," Laura said. "Yes, I do. The court settlement is finished. This isn't legal debt." "Then what is it?" "Responsibility." Laura's eyes filled. "You don't have to buy forgiveness." I'm paying back money I should never have risked." Laura folded the papers. "I forgave you years ago." Richard stared. "You never said." "I didn't know you needed me to." "I didn't either." Laura took a breath. "I forgive you." He cried. So did she. Not because everything was repaired, because it no longer needed to be. Richard recovered and lived another 11 years. When he died at 74 after a second heart attack, Laura attended his funeral with James. Ethan spoke. Madison spoke. Laura did not. Afterward, Ethan handed her a small box Richard had left for her. Inside was the watch strap Laura had given Richard on their 22nd anniversary, the night he asked for divorce. There was a note. "I kept this because it reminds me that even on the night I broke our marriage, you arrived still trying to care for something that belonged to me. I did not deserve that version of you. I hope the life you built afterward gave you back everything I made you question." Laura cried. James read the note and returned it. "That is a good apology. It took 20 years. Some people are slow." She laughed through tears. Laura placed the watch strap beside Richard's 6-page letter, not as a shrine, as evidence, not of betrayal but of change. One afternoon, years later, Madison's daughter found the box. "Grandma, what's this?" "A long story." "I like stories." Laura sat beside her granddaughter and told enough. She spoke about marriage, trust, mistakes, divorce, and the way adults sometimes build secret lives because they are afraid to say the truth aloud. "Did Grandpa Richard love you?" the girl asked. "And yes." "Then why did he hurt you?" Laura thought carefully. "Because loving someone does not automatically make you brave, honest, or wise." "Did you love him after?" "And yes." "Even when you married Grandpa James?" "And yes." "That's confusing." "Most true things are." "Did you hate him?" "For a while." "Then what?" Laura looked toward the window. "Then I got tired of letting what he did decide who I was." The years between Laura's second wedding and Richard's final illness were not empty years. They were the years in which everyone in the Bennett family learned what consequences looked like after the dramatic part was over. There were no judges anymore. No attorneys copying each other on emails. No lists of assets or arguments about who had paid for which repair. Instead, there were birthdays, graduations, illnesses, new relationships, and the strange work of deciding how much room the past would be allowed to occupy. The first Christmas after Laura married James was especially difficult for Madison. She had spent years becoming comfortable with the fact that her parents were divorced, but seeing her mother married to someone else made the permanence of it feel new again. Madison was 24 by then, old enough to understand the logic and young enough to resent it anyway. She arrived at Laura and James's house on Christmas Eve carrying 2 bottles of wine and a bad mood. James noticed before Laura did. "Your daughter hates my stockings," he whispered while Madison was upstairs. Laura looked at the mantel. James had ordered matching stockings embroidered with everyone's names, including Ethan, Madison, and his own sons, Caleb and Aaron. "She does not hate the stockings. She looked at mine like it committed tax fraud." Laura almost laughed. Then Madison came downstairs. "Dad is alone tonight." Laura's smile faded. Richard had been invited to spend Christmas Eve with Ethan and his girlfriend, but a storm had grounded Ethan's flight. He told me he's fine, Laura said. Madison crossed her arms. You always say people are fine when you don't want to deal with something. That is unfair. Madison stared. Laura exhaled. Okay, that is probably partly true. James quietly picked up a tray and disappeared into the kitchen. Madison's eyes filled. He doesn't have anyone. He has friends. That isn't family. Laura sat down. Do you want to go see him? Madison looked surprised. You wouldn't care. Of course I'd care. That sounded like permission. It isn't permission, you're 24. Madison sat across from her. I feel like if I leave, I'm choosing him. Laura understood immediately. The divorce had trained both children to think in invisible scales. Time with one parent sometimes felt like subtraction from the other. You are not choosing between us, Laura said. I know. No, I don't think you do. Madison looked at her. You are allowed to love your father in my house. Tears filled Madison's eyes. You're allowed to be angry with him in his house. You're allowed to think he was wrong and still care whether he is alone on Christmas Eve. Madison wiped her face. Do you ever feel sorry for him? And yes. Does James know? From the kitchen, James called, I can hear you. Madison laughed through tears. James stepped into the room. I am emotionally secure enough to survive Laura feeling sorry for her ex-husband. Laura smiled. Show off. He shrugged. Madison looked between them. Then she picked up her coat. I'm going to take Dad dinner. Laura nodded. Madison hesitated. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. When the door closed, Laura sat quietly. James handed her a glass of wine. That hurt. Laura looked at him. And yes. Want to talk? No. I'm okay. He sat beside her anyway. That was one of the differences between James and Richard. Richard had often treated silence as evidence that nothing was wrong. James understood silence could be full. 2 hours later, Madison returned. Her eyes were red. What happened? Laura asked. Nothing bad. She sat down. Dad still has the old ornament. Laura knew immediately which one. A cheap wooden house Ethan had painted in kindergarten. The roof was crooked. Madison's toddler fingerprint was pressed into one side in red paint. Richard had taken it when he moved out. He put it on a tiny tree. Laura swallowed. Madison continued. He said he almost threw it away after the divorce because looking at it made him hate himself. Laura looked down. He kept it because... He said hating himself was not the same as taking responsibility. Laura felt something in her chest loosen. Richard was learning. Slowly. Painfully. But learning. The next summer, Laura encountered Natalie for the first time since the affair. It happened at a fundraising luncheon for the nonprofit where Laura worked. She was reviewing place cards when she saw a woman standing across the ballroom speaking with a donor. Natalie looked different from Laura's imagination. That was the first surprise. For years, Laura had pictured her as flawless. Younger, more beautiful, effortlessly confident. A woman so compelling that a man would gamble a marriage, home, business, and family for her. The real Natalie looked human. Pretty. Nervous. Tired around the eyes. When Natalie saw Laura, her face went pale. Laura considered walking away. Then Natalie approached. Laura. Hello. I didn't know you worked here. I do. I can leave. Laura looked at her. Why? Natalie seemed confused. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. You already did that years ago. Natalie flinched. Laura immediately regretted the sharpness. Not because Natalie deserved protection. Because Laura no longer wanted cruelty to be her reflex. She took a breath. You don't need to leave. Natalie nodded. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Natalie said, I'm sorry. Laura looked at her. I know that probably means nothing. It means something. Natalie's eyes filled. I told myself Richard's marriage was already over. Laura waited. He said you two were basically roommates. Laura almost smiled. People having affairs love that phrase. Natalie looked ashamed. He said you hadn't been happy in years. Did he tell you I knew that? No. Then the marriage wasn't over. Natalie nodded. I know that now. Laura looked across the ballroom. Why did you end it? Natalie's face changed. That probably isn't your business. No. But you want to know. And yes. Natalie looked down at her hands. Because once the restaurant financing was secured, Richard started talking about divorce like it was a project plan. Laura listened. He had lists, timelines. He talked about where he would live, what he'd do with the house, how he thought Ethan would be angry but come around. Laura's stomach tightened. Natalie continued. And I realized he wasn't leaving because he loved me. He was using me as proof that he had another life waiting. Laura stared. That sounds accurate. Natalie wiped at her eyes. I also realized I didn't want to become the woman responsible for helping him explain why his family collapsed. You were already part of it. I know. Laura looked at her. Did you love him? Natalie thought. I loved how he made me feel. Laura almost laughed. Richard had said something similar in his letter. Natalie continued. I thought that was the same thing. Laura nodded. It can feel like it. Natalie looked surprised by the lack of attack. Do you hate me? Laura considered. No. You did. And yes. What changed? Laura looked toward the tables. I got tired. Natalie gave a small, sad laugh. That's fair. No, I mean I got tired of giving you that much space in my head. Natalie swallowed. I'm sorry. Laura nodded. So am I. They did not become friends. They never spoke again. But Laura left the ballroom feeling lighter. For years, Natalie had existed in her memory as an explanation for what happened. Now she was just a person who had made selfish choices with another selfish person. That was less powerful. Richard heard about the encounter from Madison. He called Laura that evening. She told me you saw Natalie. Laura raised an eyebrow. Madison needs hobbies. She said you were civil. I was. Richard was quiet. Thank you. Laura frowned. For what? I don't know. Then don't thank me. He laughed. Right. Did you ever talk to her again? Natalie. Yes. No. Not once. Once. Laura waited. About a year after the divorce. What did she want? To apologize. To you. Yes. Laura almost laughed. Did you accept? I told her I had no right to be angry at her for not wanting the mess I created. Laura leaned against the counter. That is annoyingly mature. I had an expensive therapist. Money well spent. Richard laughed. Then said Laura. And yes. I'm glad you're happy. The sentence should have been easy. It wasn't. She heard the effort beneath it. I am. I know. And I hope you are too. He paused. I'm getting there. That was true. Richard's life after the divorce was quieter than the life he had imagined while cheating. No spontaneous relocation. No glamorous restaurant partnership. No reinvention. He went to work, paid debt, cooked simple dinners, saw his children when they allowed it, went to therapy, learned to live with himself without the distraction of pretending a new woman could erase an old man's fear. At 56, he sold the last of his luxury cars and bought a used SUV. At 57, he closed the downtown office and moved the brokerage to a smaller building. At 58, he started mentoring younger agents. One of them, a 29-year-old named Marcus, complained constantly about his wife. She doesn't understand how hard I work. Richard looked up from a policy file. How old are your kids? 5 and 2. Your wife worked part-time. Who handles daycare when a kid gets sick? Marcus frowned. She does. Doctor appointments. Usually her. Groceries. What is this? Richard leaned back. You said she doesn't understand how hard you work. She doesn't. Do you understand how hard she works? Marcus looked annoyed. This is not marriage counseling. No. Richard returned to the file. But if you start treating someone else's attention like evidence your wife is failing you, you'll remember this conversation. Marcus stared. What makes you think I'm doing that? Richard looked at him. Marcus's face changed. Richard said quietly, because men in trouble are less original than they think. Marcus never asked what Richard meant. 3 months later, he transferred departments. Richard hoped he went home and told the truth. Laura never knew about that conversation. Some changes happen without witnesses. That mattered too. Ethan's wedding brought another test. He was 31 by then, and marrying a woman named Priya Shah, an aerospace engineer he met in Colorado. The wedding would be in Denver. Ethan called Laura 6 months before. I need to ask something weird. How weird? Dad wants to give a toast. Laura smiled. That is not weird. I'm worried. About what? That he'll make it about regrets. Laura understood. Richard had become more open in recent years, sometimes too open. Shame had once made him secretive. Recovery occasionally made him confessional. Have you asked him what he plans to say? No. Then ask. What if he gets offended? He'll survive. Ethan sighed. I hate managing everyone. Laura went still. Those words sounded familiar. Then don't. What? You are not responsible for managing your father's emotions. Mom, I mean it. But if he gives some speech about losing you, then Madison will tackle him before dessert. Ethan laughed. Laura continued. Tell him what you need. Trust him to decide whether he can respect it. Ethan did. Richard's toast lasted 2 minutes. He spoke about Ethan being the kind of child who asked how everything worked, and the kind of man who learned that understanding a system did not mean controlling it. Then Richard said, marriage will tempt you to believe you can hide small failures until you have time to fix them. Don't. Tell the truth while the problem is still small. Laura looked down. Richard never mentioned her. Never mentioned divorce. Never mentioned betrayal. He made the lesson useful without making himself the center. Ethan cried. So did Richard. Afterward, Ethan hugged his father. Laura watched from across the room. James stood beside her. That seems big. It is. You okay? Yes. You say that a lot. I mean it this time. Later, Richard approached. Did I behave? Laura smiled. Surprisingly. High praise. Don't get used to it. He laughed, then glanced at James. Take care of her. Laura rolled her eyes. I am standing right here. James smiled. She mostly takes care of herself. Richard looked at Laura. That was always true. For a second, the past surfaced. Not painfully, just visibly. Laura nodded. And yes, one winter, Richard called Laura after midnight. She answered because nobody called after midnight with good news. Is it Madison? No. Ethan? No. Then what happened? Richard sounded strange. I found Dad's journals. Laura sat up. Richard's father, Harold, had died during the marriage. What journals? Boxes from Mom's house. I never went through them. Laura waited. There's one about me. She could hear him crying. Richard. He knew. Knew what? That I was unhappy. Laura looked toward James, sleeping beside her. When? Before he died. How? Richard read a passage. Harold had written that his son seemed restless, that Richard talked about money as if it were a measure of whether he had wasted his life, and that he worried Richard confused admiration with love. Laura closed her eyes. He wrote that. And yes. Richard's voice broke. He said, I hope he learns before he hurts Laura that a new life does not require destroying the old one. Laura's throat tightened. Harold had died 2 years before the affair began. He saw it coming. Maybe. I wished he told me. Would you have listened? A silence. Then Richard laughed through tears. No. Laura smiled sadly. That might be why he wrote it instead. Richard cried quietly. Do you ever think people saw us more clearly than we saw ourselves? And yes. Who? Our children. He laughed. That hurts. It should. They spoke for 20 minutes. When Laura hung up, James was awake. Everything okay? Richard found something from his father. James nodded. Want to talk about it? Laura told him. James listened. Then said that's sad. And yes. And useful. And yes. James rolled onto his side. People always imagine warnings would change them. Laura looked at him. You don't. Sometimes they do. Usually pain teaches better. That is depressing. I teach engineers, I'm practical. Laura laughed. The next morning, she thought about Harold's sentence. A new life does not require destroying the old one. Richard had believed otherwise. So had Laura in a different way. Early in the divorce, she believed she had to reject every good memory to justify leaving. If Richard had betrayed her, then perhaps the marriage had been false. If the marriage had been false, leaving was simple. But it had not been false. It had been real and then damaged. Good and then dishonest. Loving and then unsafe. People preferred clean stories because clean stories were easier to carry. Laura no longer needed one. Madison had her own crisis several years later. She was 30, engaged to a man named Kevin, and 3 months from her wedding when she arrived at Laura's house unexpectedly. James opened the door. Your daughter looks like she has committed a felony. Madison pushed past him. Helpful. Laura came from the kitchen. What happened? Madison started crying. Kevin lied. Laura's stomach tightened. About what? Debt? Madison sat. Kevin had more than $90,000 in student loans and credit card debt. He had told her the number was closer to 30. Laura listened. Did he cheat? No. Gamble? No. Hide spending? Not exactly. What does that mean? He was ashamed. Laura sat beside her. Does he admit he lied? And yes. Is he willing to show everything? And yes. Then what do you want? Madison looked almost offended. Aren't you supposed to tell me to leave? Laura understood why. Because of your father. And yes. And no. Madison stared. Your father's affair is not a template for every betrayal. He lied about money too. And yes. And so you have to decide what this lie means in your relationship. Madison wiped her face. I don't know. Then postpone the wedding. Her eyes widened. You think I should cancel? I said postpone. That will embarrass Kevin. Laura stared. Madison laughed bitterly. Right, not my problem. His embarrassment is not a reason to marry before you feel safe. Madison nodded slowly. What if I forgive him and he does it again? You cannot guarantee he won't. That's awful advice. It's honest advice. Madison looked down. Then how do people trust anyone? Laura thought of Richard. James. Natalie. Ethan's envelope. Years of consequences. By paying attention to what they do after the truth is known. Madison looked at her. Not what they promise. Promises matter. But repair is behavior. Madison postponed the wedding. Kevin entered financial counseling, gave her access to every account, stopped using credit cards, and took a second job temporarily to pay down the highest interest balances. He did not complain that she was punishing him. He did not accuse her of being controlling. He answered the same questions repeatedly. 6 months later, Madison chose to marry him. Before the ceremony, Richard found Laura. Do you think she's making a mistake? Laura smiled. Are you asking because you're worried or because you think your history makes you an expert? Both. Kevin is not you. I know. Madison is not me. I know. So let them make their own marriage. Richard nodded. That's hard. Parenting adult children is mostly watching them make choices you can't control. Richard smiled. You were always better at that. Laura raised an eyebrow. Absolutely not. They laughed. During the reception, Madison danced with Richard. Laura watched. Madison rested her head on her father's shoulder. Richard cried. Years earlier, she had slapped him and said she hated him. Both things were true parts of their relationship. Neither was the whole. One of the most unexpected changes came when Laura's nonprofit faced a financial crisis. A major donor withdrew funding, and the board considered layoffs. Laura, now executive finance director, worked long hours. James noticed. You're doing that thing. What thing? The thing where everyone else's emergency becomes your bloodstream. Laura frowned. I have responsibilities. And yes. And so Richard wasn't the only person in your marriage who could disappear into work. Laura went still. That is a low blow. It wasn't meant as one. It landed like one. James sat across from her. I'm not comparing you to him. It sounds like it. I'm saying you learned something about yourself during the divorce too. Laura looked away. James continued. You become indispensable when you're scared. The sentence hurt because it was true. Laura had spent years believing Richard's betrayal revealed only his weaknesses. Therapy had taught her otherwise. She had her own patterns. Control. Overfunctioning. Silence disguised as competence. When frightened, she organized. When hurt, she became useful. When angry, she became efficient. James reached for her hand. I don't need you to save your entire organization. They may lay people off. I know. I can help. I know. That is my job. And yes. Laura stared. Then what are we arguing about? Whether your job gets every part of you because you're afraid somebody will suffer if you rest. She started crying. James squeezed her hand. I love that you care. She looked at him. I also want you here. Laura thought of Richard's complaint all those years ago. He had felt trapped by adulthood. She had dismissed it because his response was selfish. But the feeling itself had been real. She had not asked enough questions. That did not cause the affair. Richard caused the affair. Still, Laura understood something new. A spouse could be responsible for betrayal, while both spouses were responsible for whether they had known each other well before it happened. That distinction was difficult. It was also freeing. Laura took a week off. The organization survived. She laughed when she returned. James said, shocking. Do not enjoy this. I'm enjoying it enormously. They went away for a weekend. On the second night, Laura said, I think I owe Richard something. James nearly choked on his drink. That is not what husbands want to hear on vacation. Not like that. What? An apology. James listened. For what? For making him feel unseen. James waited. Laura continued. Not for the affair, not for the money, for my part in the marriage before it broke. James nodded slowly. Do you need to say it to him? I don't know. Then ask why you want to. Laura thought. To be honest. That sounds good. When she returned home, she called Richard. They met at a coffee shop. Richard looked nervous. What happened? Nothing. Then why are we meeting? I want to say something. That sounds worse. Laura smiled. I'm sorry I stopped asking who you were becoming. Richard stared. She continued. I got so busy running our life that I treated stability like proof we were okay. His eyes filled. Laura, you do not owe me. I know. Then why? Because your betrayal does not erase my mistakes. Richard looked down. I used your mistakes to justify mine. And yes, that wasn't fair. And no. He laughed softly. There's that sentence. Laura smiled. I'm sorry I made competence into a wall. Richard wiped his eyes. I'm sorry I used loneliness as permission to become dishonest. They sat quietly. Then Richard said, You know this is the conversation I thought we would have if we reconciled. Laura nodded. And we never did. No. Do you ever wonder? No. He smiled sadly. You answered fast. I have a good life. I know. And I think we needed the marriage to end before we could speak like this. Richard looked out the window. Probably. That conversation changed something. Not dramatically. They did not become friends who called weekly. But the remaining defensiveness faded. At family events, they could speak about shared memories without anyone freezing. They could laugh about Richard's terrible chili. Laura could mention the old cabin without Madison looking nervous. History became history instead of evidence. Richard eventually began dating a woman named Alina, a librarian 2 years older than him. The family was shocked. Madison called Laura. Dad is dating someone. I know. You know. He told James. What? They ran into each other at the hardware store. This family is disturbing. Laura laughed. Is she nice? I don't know. You haven't met her. No. Then stop interrogating me. Madison sighed. Are you weird about it? No. Really? Yes. Madison paused. Mom. What? I'm proud of you. Laura smiled. That sounded patronizing. It was. Alina lasted 3 years. She and Richard eventually ended kindly. Richard told Laura once she wanted to move to Arizona. You hate heat. I know. So? I thought about going. Why didn't you? Richard smiled. I finally learned not every relationship has to be saved by making yourself disappear. Laura stared. That was almost wise. Therapy. Again, money well spent. They laughed. When Ethan and Priya had their first child, Richard and Laura became grandparents within the same hour. They arrived at the hospital separately. Laura held baby Myra first. Richard stood beside her. She has Ethan's ears. Laura frowned. Poor child. Richard laughed. Then his eyes filled. We did okay with them. Laura looked at Ethan through the nursery glass. We made mistakes. And yes, they survived. And yes, that counts. Richard nodded. For a moment, Laura remembered them holding newborn Ethan 28 years earlier. Young, terrified, certain love would be enough. She had once mocked that certainty. Now she felt tenderness for it. They had not known what marriage would demand. Nobody did. Several years later, Richard finally told Ethan the full story of the envelope. Not the documents Ethan already knew. The hatred Richard had felt afterward. They sat on Ethan's porch in Colorado. I thought you betrayed me, Richard said. Ethan stared. I know. How? You wouldn't answer my calls. Richard nodded. I was furious. I was trying to protect Mom. I know that now. Ethan looked toward the mountains. Would you have moved the house into that trust? Richard was quiet. I don't know. That is not reassuring. It is the truth. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard continued. I wanted the option. The option to do what? To control what happened once the divorce started. Ethan stared. And so yes. Maybe. Dad. Richard took a breath. I was scared she would freeze accounts, take the business, turn you against me. You turned us against you. And yes. Ethan looked away. Richard continued. I needed to imagine she was dangerous, because otherwise I had to admit I was the danger. Ethan's eyes filled. That is messed up. And yes. Do you know what it was like carrying those papers? No. I couldn't sleep. Richard started crying. I'm sorry. I kept thinking if I told Mom and I was wrong, I would destroy the family. You didn't. I know. Ethan wiped his face. You did. Richard nodded. And yes. They sat in silence. Then Ethan said, I forgive you. Richard looked at him. But I need you to understand something. What? I forgive you because I don't want to carry that 20-year-old version of myself forever. Richard's face crumpled. Okay. Not because what you did was okay. I know. Ethan nodded. That conversation gave Richard something he had wanted for years. Not absolution. A relationship with his son that was no longer built around avoiding one subject. Madison's forgiveness remained different. She loved Richard, called him, visited, but whenever money entered a conversation, she became suspicious. One Thanksgiving, Richard offered to contribute to a family rental house for everyone. Madison immediately said, "What's the catch?" The table went silent. Richard's face changed. Madison looked ashamed. "I'm sorry." Richard took a breath. "No, that's mine." "What?" "You don't trust me with money, because I gave you reasons not to." Madison's eyes filled. "It's been years. Trust doesn't follow calendars." Laura looked at him. He continued, "I'll send the money to Ethan, he can book it." Madison laughed through tears. "That is ridiculous." "Probably." Then she smiled. "Okay." That was how repair worked. Not grand speeches. Small accommodations that did not demand the wound disappear. Years later, when Richard died, Madison would remember that Thanksgiving more clearly than the courthouse years. She would remember him saying trust did not follow calendars. Laura would remember too. The family's final years with Richard were peaceful. Not perfect. He still irritated everyone. He gave too much advice. He was late. He bought ridiculous gifts for grandchildren. He developed an obsession with smoking meat and ruined 2 Christmas dinners. James tolerated him with surprising affection. At Ethan's 40th birthday, Richard and James ended up assembling a complicated outdoor playset for Myra's children. Richard held a bolt. "This piece is wrong." James looked at the instructions. "No, you are wrong. I built a brokerage. You sold insurance. I managed people. You are holding the bolt backward." Richard stared. Laura watched from the porch with Madison. "This is disturbing," Madison said. "What?" "Your husband's fighting over playground equipment." "One is my husband." "You know what I mean." Richard shouted, "Laura, tell him I'm right." She called back, "James is right." Richard looked betrayed. James smiled. Madison laughed. That image stayed with Laura. 2 men representing 2 different parts of her life, arguing over a bolt while grandchildren ran through the yard. There had been a time when she thought moving forward required cutting the past away completely. Instead, she learned integration. Richard did not disappear because the marriage ended. James did not become less important because Richard remained family. The children did not have to erase their father's betrayal to love him. Laura did not have to erase 22 years of marriage to honor the life she built afterward. It was messier than a clean ending. It was also more human. After Richard's death, Laura helped Ethan and Madison sort his townhome. James came too. There were boxes everywhere. Richard had kept almost everything. Old birthday cards. Programs from school plays. A coffee mug Madison painted when she was 9. Ethan found the original manila envelope folder in a locked filing cabinet. Empty. He stared at it. Laura recognized it. That's it. Ethan nodded. I haven't seen this in 25 years. Madison looked over. What? The envelope. Her face changed. So? For a moment, the 3 stood silently. James remained near the doorway. Ethan turned the folder over. There was writing on the back in Richard's hand. Ethan read aloud. The envelope my son used to save his mother from the man I had become. Laura covered her mouth. Madison started crying. Below it, Richard had written another line. I hated this for years. Now I keep it because it reminds me that the truth arrived before I could make things worse. Ethan sat down. Laura put a hand on his shoulder. I didn't know he kept it. Neither did I. Madison touched the folder. Do we keep it? Ethan looked at Laura. She shook her head. That is your decision. Ethan's thought, then placed it in a box labeled family. Not trash. Not a shrine. Family. That felt right. They found one more document later that afternoon. Richard's old separation proposal from the anniversary dinner. The white envelope had never been opened by Laura. Richard had kept it. Madison asked, "Do you want to read it now?" Laura stared at the envelope. 25 years of curiosity flickered. Then faded. No. Really? And yes. What if there's something important? There isn't. How do you know? Laura smiled. Because whatever he thought that night is not more important than what he became afterward. Madison nodded. Ethan held the envelope over the shredder. Laura stopped him. Wait. He looked up. She took it. For one moment, she held the object Richard once intended to use to begin the end of their marriage. Then she fed it into the shredder herself. The machine pulled the pages in. Madison laughed through tears. That was dramatic. I earned it. James smiled. You absolutely did. The paper disappeared. Laura felt nothing explode inside her. No surge of revenge. No sudden closure. Just a quiet sense that she no longer needed the version of the story Richard had written before she knew the truth. She already knew enough. There was one final lesson Laura learned before that last visit to Richard's grave, and it came from James. For most of their marriage, James had been patient with the parts of Laura that still expected betrayal to announce itself through small changes. A phone faced on a table, a late arrival, a change in tone, a forgotten explanation. Laura knew it was unfair to treat every ordinary inconsistency like evidence, but knowledge did not always control instinct. One evening James came home almost 3 hours late. He had texted that a project meeting was running long. Then his phone battery died. Laura called twice. No answer. By the time he walked through the door, she had imagined a dozen explanations. Half of them were reasonable. The other half had Natalie's shadow. James entered carrying a grocery bag. Why are you awake? Laura stared at him. Your phone was off. Dead. You said the meeting ended at 8. It did. It's almost 11. James stopped. He knew that expression. I went to Caleb's. Laura's chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? I thought I did. You didn't. He pulled out his phone, plugged it in, and waited. The screen lit. There was an unsent message. Going to Caleb's, he's having a rough night, don't wait up. James showed her. Laura felt foolish. Then angry. Not at James. At how quickly fear had returned. He looked at her carefully. Where did your mind go? Nowhere. Laura. She sat down. I thought maybe you were lying. James did not become defensive. That almost made her cry. About Caleb. About anything. He sat across from her. Because Richard lied. And yes. James nodded. Laura stared. That should not still happen. Why not? It's been decades. So? I trust you. I know. Then why does my brain do that? James leaned back. Because trust is not amnesia. Laura looked at him. He continued. You don't owe me a version of you that was never hurt. Her eyes filled. That sounds exhausting for you. Sometimes. Laura laughed sadly. I'm sorry. I didn't ask for an apology. You're getting one. Fine. She reached for his hand. I'm sorry, I sometimes make you answer questions Richard created. James squeezed her fingers. And I'm sorry, I didn't double-check the text sent. Laura laughed. That is absurd. Still true. That conversation stayed with her. Trust was not amnesia. Laura had spent years thinking healing would eventually mean she stopped noticing every resemblance to the past. Instead, healing meant noticing without obeying. She could feel fear and still choose not to accuse. She could remember betrayal and still allow a different man to be different. She could be cautious without becoming closed. That was harder than forgetting. It was also more honest. Later, when Madison struggled after Kevin forgot to mention a work dinner, Laura recognized the same panic in her daughter. He didn't answer for 2 hours, Madison said. Was he where he said he was? And yes. Did he lie? No. Then what are you afraid of? Madison looked at her. That one day I'll discover I was stupid. Laura's heart hurt. Trusting someone who betrays you does not make you stupid. Madison's eyes filled. That sounds like something you had to learn. It took a while. What if he changes? He might. That is terrible. And yes. So what do I do? Laura smiled sadly. You make choices based on who he is now, not on who someone else became. Madison nodded. The generational echo was obvious. Richard's choices had shaped more than one marriage. But they no longer controlled them. The grandchildren grew up knowing the family history in simple forms. Grandpa Richard and Grandma Laura used to be married. Then they divorced. Grandma married James. Grandpa Richard lived by himself for a long time. Nobody whispered. Nobody invented deaths to make family trees easier. At a school project, Myra's daughter drew a diagram with too many lines. Her teacher asked, "Is James your grandfather?" The child replied, "He is one of them." That answer made Laura laugh for an entire afternoon. One Sunday, the grandchildren asked Richard and James which one was the real grandpa. Richard immediately pointed at James. He has better snacks. James pointed at Richard. He gives you money. The children decided both qualified. Laura watched the exchange with a strange gratitude. Adults often feared children would be damaged by complicated families. Sometimes children simply learned that relationships could have more than one shape. The damage came from secrecy, loyalty tests, and making love conditional. Laura knew that now. When Richard turned 70, Ethan organized a surprise dinner. Laura attended with James. During dessert, Ethan gave Richard a framed photograph from the college graduation years earlier. Richard, Laura, Ethan, and Madison together. Richard stared at it. I remember this. You should. You threatened me before the photo. Ethan laughed. I told you not to make it weird. You were very specific. Madison added, and somehow you still made it weird. Everyone laughed. Richard looked at Laura. You hated that day. No. You hated sitting next to me. For the first 10 minutes. What changed? Madison graduated. He nodded. Then Richard looked around the table. I spent years thinking this was what I lost. What? Ethan asked. Family. Nobody spoke. Richard continued. I thought divorce took it. Laura watched. It didn't. His eyes filled. I damaged it, then all of you rebuilt it without pretending the damage wasn't there. Madison reached across the table. Richard took her hand. Laura looked toward James. He smiled. Later in the car, Laura said, that was a lot. James nodded. He's becoming sentimental. He was always sentimental. He hid it behind bad financial decisions. Laura laughed, then grew quiet. I'm glad he gets to see this. What? That we survived. James looked at her. You survived before he understood. I know. But it matters that he knows. And yes. James reached for her hand. Laura understood something she had resisted for years. Forgiveness was not only release for the person who had been hurt. Sometimes it allowed the person who caused harm to stop defining themselves entirely by the harm. That did not mean victims were responsible for rescuing guilty people. Laura had never forgiven Richard to save him. But once she no longer needed anger to protect herself, she could acknowledge his growth without feeling that she was minimizing the betrayal. That freedom belonged to her. Richard benefited from it. That was acceptable. On the 10th anniversary of Laura and James's marriage, Ethan and Madison surprised them with a video montage. There were photographs from trips, birthdays, grandchildren, family dinners, and holidays. Halfway through, one image appeared unexpectedly. Richard at a barbecue, standing beside James, both laughing. Laura burst out laughing. Who put that in? Madison raised her hand. James said, I look excellent. Richard, sitting in the back, called, I look better. Everyone groaned. Laura looked at the screen. There it was. The life she never could have imagined on the night Richard placed the white envelope on the anniversary table. No return to the old marriage. No neat replacement. Something larger. A family that had learned to make room for truth without organizing itself around punishment. A second husband secure enough not to fear a first husband's memory. Children strong enough to love a father they once despised. An ex-husband humble enough to attend celebrations where he was not central. And Laura. Not destroyed. That sentence still mattered. Not destroyed. She had once repeated it as defiance. Now it was simply fact. The last family dinner Richard attended before his health began to decline was ordinary, which was exactly why Laura remembered it. There were no confessions and no important announcements. Ethan burned the rolls. Madison complained that Kevin had bought another unnecessary kitchen gadget. James argued with Richard about baseball. The grandchildren ran between rooms until someone threatened to take away dessert. At one point, Laura stood alone at the sink rinsing plates. Richard walked in carrying 2 glasses. You need help. You asking that 20 years too late? He laughed. Probably. He picked up a towel and began drying. For several minutes they worked without speaking. Then Richard looked toward the dining room, where James was helping one of the grandchildren build something from magnetic blocks. You chose well. Laura looked at him. And yes, that used to hurt. I know. Now it makes me relieved. She paused. Why? Because I spent years afraid I ruined your chance to trust anybody again. Laura set down a plate. You hurt my trust. Richard nodded. But you didn't own what happened to it afterward. He looked at her. That is one of the hardest things you ever taught me. What? That consequences can belong to me without the rest of your life belonging to me. Laura smiled faintly. You learned slowly. I've been told. They finished the dishes. Before leaving the kitchen, Richard said, Thank you for not teaching the kids that loving me was disloyal to you. Laura swallowed. There were days I wanted to. I know. But they deserved their own relationship with you. Richard's eyes filled. So did you. She looked at him. What? You deserved your own relationship with yourself, not just wife, mother, accountant, fixer. Laura laughed softly. You really did get sentimental. Old age. Convenient excuse. He smiled. Then they returned to the table. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the gift. After years when every interaction seemed loaded with history, the family had finally reached a place where an ordinary dinner could simply be ordinary. Laura later understood that reconciliation was often measured that way, not by tears or speeches, but by the return of ordinary things. A joke that did not carry a hidden accusation, a holiday where nobody tracked who sat beside whom, a phone call that did not begin with fear, a shared meal where the past was present only because everyone already knew it. That kind of peace had taken years. It was worth more than forgetting. When Laura was 72, she visited Richard's grave. James waited in the car. Laura stood beneath a maple tree and said, "You were an idiot." Then she smiled. "I was too sometimes. I'm glad you became better. I'm glad I did too." For years, people had asked whether she regretted the divorce. She never did. She regretted the betrayal. She regretted the secrets. She regretted what Ethan carried alone. She regretted how Madison's final year of high school became tangled with anger. But she did not regret drawing a line. She did not regret protecting the home Richard had quietly placed at risk. She did not regret refusing to beg him to remain in a marriage he had already been leaving in secret. Most of all, she did not regret discovering that the end of one life could become the beginning of another. Not better because it was easier. Better because it was honest. When Laura reached the car, James opened the passenger door from inside. "You okay?" And yes. Really? She smiled. Really? He started the engine. They drove home. And Laura left the past where it belonged, not hidden, not denied, not controlling the future, just known.